So hopefully everyone's able to see that. And in this presentation today, I wanted to be talking about this idea of legato and kind of what it means to be playing between and inside the notes on the clarinet. And how do we accomplish this? And the reason I was thinking about this is because I was thinking about competitions, and obviously we're doing this and to sort of promote and encourage and artistry on the clarinet, especially as it pertains to this Silverstein clarinet contest that we're all very excited about. And I was thinking to when I've adjudicated or been performing, what kind of separates that top 10% from the other entrants. And I thought to myself, a lot of the time it's how they're shaping their notes and how they're executing the legato and making the instrument just subservient to the musical idea instead of letting the instrument control everything. And that's kind of how I decided to talk about at least this today. So I hope we'll all find something beneficial from this presentation. So, legato in action. And when I was thinking about what is something in the clarinet repertoire that is just like the ultimate legato, like final exam, if you will, this is what came to mind. Does anyone recognize what this piece of music is, or what this excerpt of music is? If you hear it, it might sound familiar, especially for anyone who's been ever doing the orchestra audition scene at any point. So this is a lovely solo from Beethoven's Fourth Symphony, the second movement. And I was thinking about this, and this sort of tests all of the elements of clarinet legato. We've got register changes here and here. We have these sort of wider intervals here. We've got this awkward sort of side key getting down to the clarion D. It's all a test of how smooth can we play on this instrument. And for me, that legato quality ends up being what separates, again, that top 10% of performers that I hear, regardless of instrument, but especially on clarinet, because there's so many odd acoustical things with this instrument, little quirks and idiosyncrasies that other instruments maybe don't have to deal with as much. And so, in the spirit of legato, we want to talk about kind of what that is and how do we define that. And for me, the idea of legato playing is about the seamless connection between all of our notes. Sort of that very vocal sound. We always hear when we play wind instruments, imitate the singer, imitate the voice. And I think a lot of that really stems from this idea of connecting the notes and not having them feel like we're pressing, little keys or buttons or whatever on the instrument we're playing. And this legato is the result of a very rapid and sort of insistent airstream. And it's not necessarily a slur. You can have elements of legato playing even if the notes aren't slurred. I mean, and conversely, you could have a slur that isn't very legato. I think everyone who's ever played Schubert's Shepherd on the Rock, for instance, has probably had one time or another, unfortunately, go. Where I didn't tongue the note, but it didn't speak right away, unfortunately. We want that seamless quality. And ultimately, legato is coming down to the fact that your air connects all the notes, but you can't allow anything else to impede the air, whether it's your fingers, your embouchure, your tongue, and nothing can get in the way of that. And that's what I feel like a lot of clarinet playing is. We're trying to get out of our own way at a certain point. So we understand the concept of legato. Now, how do we actually make that happen? And that's kind of the bigger question for all of us. And there's about 4 main components that I find are really essential to this. And the first thing I want to discuss as it relates to this is the idea of Bernoulli's principle. So anyone who's done any work in physics or fluid dynamics is probably familiar with this idea, and it sounds more complicated than it is. There's a lot of math involved, and I don't really want to do math at this time of day, and nor do I understand the math in the first place. So we'll do the very short and easy version. Leonardo da Vinci discovered that a fluid, and for our purposes air, wind, functions as a fluid. A fluid forced through a smaller opening increases in velocity. And I like to think about this like a garden hose. You know, you get those hoses where you've got the different attachments. You know, you've got the one that, there's a really wide one, there's really narrow ones, there's one that have all sorts of like 3 jets at a time. The narrow nozzle on one of those garden hoses, sprayer attachments, is going to expel the water faster and further as a result than the very broad nozzle. You could even try this, not with a hose attachment, just with a plain old hose. Turn the water on, and then like in this picture here, cover part of the opening with a thumb. And you notice that the water's all of a sudden going to get much faster because it's being forced through that smaller space. And we're trying to do the same thing with our air on the clarinet. So this first and foremost pertains to the idea of voicing. And for me, the idea of voicing is everything inside, the sort of invisible component of the embouchure. What is the tongue doing? How is the oral cavity shaped? How are both of those shaping the airstream as it flows into the instrument and through the instrument? And again, as air flows through a smaller opening, it will move faster. And what this means for us playing the clarinet is it's always about where's the tongue positioned inside the oral cavity. And the way to compress that airstream so it goes faster is to raise the tongue so the tip of the tongue is very close to the tip of the reed mouthpiece interface. And this exact positioning is very dependent on everyone's unique individual facial structure and dental structure, which then in turn affects the angle of the instrument. You think about Robert Marcellus, who played with the angle very in, partially due to his overbite in his dental structure. And for most people now, if you've gone through modern orthodontics and had braces and retainers and all of that, we tend to get that overbite corrected. And for us, for myself included, if I were to try and play like the way Marcellus did with a very inward instrument, it wouldn't happen. So we have to all find that angle for ourselves. The other thing I want to say is we've probably all heard at some point or another when we've been playing the clarinet the idea of the E vowel. Saying the letter E to help get our tongue in that higher position. And that can be really helpful. The issue sometimes is that, depending on where you're from, what dialect and language you grew up speaking, the letter E can sound very different to different people, and we pronounce that very differently. I find in the Midwest of the United States, I've been discovering this more and more, the E letter puts the tongue very high, but it also puts it a little further back in the oral cavity than might be ideal for clarinet playing. So, if we put the E further back, just speaking it kind of like E, as opposed to moving it forward, there's a slight change in the timbre there. I don't know if that's coming through the wonderful Zoom audio necessarily, but the front to back position of the tongue is something that we don't discuss quite as much. So it's important that the tongue's not only high, but high and closer to the reed. And if anyone is not familiar with this article by Ron Odrich, Science and the Art of Legato. This was the 2016 International Clarinet Association winner of the research competition, and it's a fantastic article all about the physics of legato. Where does the tongue have to be? How can we shape the oral cavity? And just for the purposes of time, I won't summarize everything that Ron says in this article, but it's a really great and very easily digestible read, no pun intended, about how can we actually make this happen on the clarinet. So that was kind of our very quick look at voicing and how it pertains to legato. Now I want to move on to something that we don't talk about quite as much maybe, and that's the idea of the finger technique. And how do our fingers play a role in legato? Essentially, the fingers and the finger motion must be precise while moving from one note to the next, and the fingers retain their curvature while they're moving. So what that means is, our fingers, we want them curved when we play, but sometimes when we play, if we're not careful, they'll straighten out as we lift. And when we straighten like this and then curve again as we're coming down, it makes it much harder to actually know where the finger's going to come down in terms of timing, in terms of placement. And any of those little variables can interrupt our legato quality, if there's a slight bump in the sound there. And Daniel Benad talked a lot about the legato fingers, where sort of they keep that curvature, but they squeeze the instrument. A lift, and then a squeeze back down. And that word squeeze, I always like to present the sort of caveat that it's not an aggressive motion, it's not a slap. For legato, we don't want to hear that finger popping as much. It should be very silent and delicate, while still having enough purpose to close the hole in a timely manner. Beyond that, one of our basic elements of finger technique as it pertains to legato is we must be able to reach all of the keys, if you're playing, depending on what clarinet you're playing, all 18, 19, 20, if you've got, depending on what you've got extra. We must be able to reach all of these keys without deviating from our basic hand position or pulling out other fingers out of position. And for instance, I sometimes see with students that they're contorting their hand to reach their pinky keys. And that's pulling this right hand ring finger out of position a little bit. So it's important that we find a hand position and a technique that allows us to reach everything while staying in our sort of base position, relatively speaking. And the common problems for this are the G sharp and the A keys, and then the lowest side key especially. So we're having to play like our low E flat or the B flat above it. Those can be very problematic in terms of keeping our hands in that basic position. Does anyone have any questions that I can answer right now about anything we've discussed so far?
Hello, my name is Naledi.
Oh. Hi, how you doing?
Hello, Dr. Cook. Good and you. My name is Naledi. I'm from South Africa.
Oh, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, with air support and air breathing for the voicing, is there a certain amount of air that we need to take? It differs every time with the phrasing we're doing, how much air we really need? Or do we every time need to take in a lot of air?
That's a great question. In terms of air, we want to take in as much as possible, in my opinion. I do a lot of work on sort of that deep breath, not just fast, but And I do a lot of work with my students in breathing in over multiple counts to try and feel that full expansion. So, if you're breathing in for 2 counts, or maybe 4 counts, you get the feeling of as much capacity as possible, and then we try and reduce that time over practice. So try and then maybe 2 counts, the same amount of air. And then maybe 1 count, just all of that. And for me, it's about inhaling as much as possible in a relaxed manner. And usually, the more relaxed we are, the more air we'll take in. Excuse me. And then when it comes to the exhale, yes, we have to exhale a good amount of air, but I find that it's at least as helpful, if not more so helpful, to think about the velocity of air that we're dealing with instead of just sheer quantity of air. Because I find when students think about blowing a lot of air, and I think this happens with all of us to an extent, we aren't focused as much on the direction and the shape of the air. So we get a sound, maybe that's loud, but it maybe is missing the quality, or it's not the color we're going for. So having an idea of visualizing your air to a certain point, I find that really helpful. A couple things I like to do are sort of imagine a bullseye or a target on the wall in front of me, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 feet away, and trying to get my air to that point. The other thing I like to do, and I have not actually made this device, but I should someday, just for fun. Imagine like a little windmill or a pinwheel at the bell, and trying to spin that with my air going all the way through the instrument. Of course, through physics, it's probably not actually going to ever work. But the visual of having something at the end of the bell that I'm trying to blow to, I find that very beneficial. And if we're using fast air, we don't have to use as much air. The faster our air is going, we don't have to use as much so quickly. So that helps expand our phrasing, and we have more air then to help shape our phrase instead of just trying to get through it in the first place. Does that help?
Yes, thank you so much. That's
very
informative.
Of course, happy to have. That's a great question. WK has a good question in the chat message as well. One of my students has long pinkies and is having trouble depressing the 2 keys on the lower stack on the right-hand side. So the F sharp and the E key. That's a really good question. Any recommendations for this? I find that sometimes if the right, this is this could be a long answer. I'll try and do a short version of it. But what can happen sometimes, depending on the hand position, is if the right hand is locked, and by that I mean it's maybe having to hold too much weight, the fingers can get stuck as a result. And without seeing your student, I don't want to make too many prescriptions in this regard, but trying to find a hand position where the instrument's weight is reduced a little bit. And for me, what that ends up being, let's do it this way. For me, putting the thumb rest kind of right here inside the knuckle of the thumb helps reduce the weight of the instrument a little bit. I see sometimes with students, if they're holding the thumb rest right on their thumbnail, or kind of what I was taught at least, sort of centered between the thumbnail and the skin, this forces the hand into a sort of uncomfortable position. And then to reach these, you're having to pull the right hand out of position a little bit. If this is angled more inward, the pinky falls into a slightly more natural position. The other thing that is super important to remember is we've talked about curvature. I talked a little bit about curvature and maintaining that curvature as the fingers lift. That's for the pinkies, that would be a false truth. The pinkies almost really need to change their shape to access the pinky keys. So this is, if I'm going for on the sort of left here for the F or the A flat, I'm a little straighter. But if I'm going over here, I'm having to curve a fair amount. And I suspect your student may already be trying this, but just due to their hand, the size of their hands and their pinky fingers, that may not be working entirely successfully. So I think checking the right hand position to make sure there's no tension. Because what can happen is if the clarinet, if we're supporting the clarinet all the way on the edge of the thumb, that's actually a little uncomfortable just for me right now. The rest of the hand, especially down here, this likes to lock up as a result. So I would say check the right hand position first. And one other thing, depending on the clarinet, you may, if it's possible, you may want to look at the thumb rest position. Because depending on the instrument, the thumb rest can maybe not be in an ideal spot. I know on my clarinet, I usually get the thumb rest raised a little bit to put my right thumb at least a little closer to in line with my first finger. If I had these thumb rests in the default position, it would be about here. And for me, I'm already feeling the tension in this part of the hand that results from having a thumb rest pretty low. So WK, I hope that answers your question. And I'd be happy to discuss this further on email or online at some point in the future. And I'll share my contact information at the end. Alan has a really good question here. He says, I was raised on the Close method books 1 and 2. What suggestions could you make for other helpful and interesting method books for technique for students? That's a really good question. I was raised on the Rubank books personally, and for anyone who's used those, they know how dry they can be at times. I find that one of the best things, yes, there are certain method books that are maybe more visually engaging and have more variety of patterns and things to work on in there. I find Stevenard actually is a great one because it goes through all your scales, but they're not in the same rhythm. You know, you've got maybe one time it's in 3/8 time or 2/4 time instead of just the same pattern for everything. And the patterns also change. Another great book in this regard is the Krebs studies. And they are not straight scales necessarily, but they do use tonal patterns and then add like neighbor tones or arpeggios into the scalar work to make them more interesting, essentially, and they're a little more realistic to music itself. I also find that the approach to the method book is very important. You know, I was just doing this with a student the other day, where you try and make a game out of the scales, essentially. And you know, I think they were doing G minor, and they had them go. Having them add one note at a time, and with the idea that if you mess up, you've got to go back, and that makes it a little more mentally engaging as well. But I find, in terms of like motivating students and sort of getting them interested in these things, sheets where they can check off as they've done each one, sort of that gamification of it. If they can see the boxes filling up with all the ones they've done, that can be really helpful, and as well as kind of rewards and incentivizing. If you get all your scales, if you learn these 4 scales, we'll work on a song from your favorite movie or something like that. That can also be really helpful. Good question. Let's keep going. Those were really good questions, and again, feel free to ask more as we go. And I'll show some exercise as it pertains to finger technique, especially these problematic areas that hopefully everyone will find beneficial for themselves and their students. The embouchure is kind of the biggie here. The embouchure is a conduit, and it sort of shapes the air in addition to voicing as it flows through the instrument. And excessive vertical pressure, which we all sort of colloquially call biting, limits the reed's ability to vibrate between notes. So if you've got what I call the death grip embouchure, and you're forcing the reed so close to the mouthpiece all the time, you're actually limiting its ability to vibrate, especially as you go from one note to the next. So we're trying to find an embouchure that is firm and secure, but not overly tight. It needs to be just firm enough that the sound is stable, without being so firm that it is damaging to play physically or limits our ability to play musically. And then airflow. This is sort of the big one. This is the overarching idea, but I find that the other three concepts of voicing, finger technique, and embouchure really need to be in play before the airflow has a chance of being successful. Once the tongue is positioned in such a way that it shapes the airstream, again, high and close to the reed, that air velocity then has to stay constant between notes. And I say constant in quotation marks because sometimes if you're going from a very free-blowing note to a resistant note, you may actually have to increase your air velocity to make that interval happen. And again, it's sort of withstanding the changes in resistance due to the register and the tube length of the instrument. I think about Brahms's Third Symphony, that solo in the first movement where you have to go G, A, B. And sometimes that B doesn't like to speak because the A is so free-blowing and the B is so resistant. A, you're only using this much of the clarinet. B, long B, you're using the whole thing. And being able to compensate for that change in resistance by increasing your air velocity is so important. And we'll be talking next about some exercises that I find useful for my own playing and for my students that I wanted to share with you that I think address all of these different areas, these four components. So if you happen to have a clarinet out with you assembled, feel free to try some of these on your as we go through them. So for voicing, the first thing I like to do with students is sometimes trace the reed. And what I mean by that is we're going to try and find exactly where the tip of the reed falls inside the oral cavity, because we're not like string players where you can see the physical maybe issues that are happening. So much of what we do is internal, and we sometimes can't see, so we have to understand what it feels like to make this happen. So what I like to do with this is form your embouchure around the mouthpiece, and then place the tip of your tongue at the meeting point between the lower lip and the reed, right where the reed meets the lower lip. And then you trace your tongue up to the tip of the reed and then drop it ever so slightly so it's just sitting below the tip of the reed. All right, if you've got your instrument, go ahead and try that. And for me, that really helps as a sort of reminder of where the tongue should be resting. And for some scenarios, you can even exaggerate this by touching the tip of the tongue all the way up to the roof of the oral cavity. And you can still get a sound while doing this. For that, right at that point, my tongue was just straight up touching the roof of my mouth. And we can still get a sound. So that overdoing it sometimes in teaching ends up being really helpful. And it's exaggerated, and then we kind of dropped out. We're able to find that middle ground. I find it's easier to always go too far and then swing back eventually. Another exercise for voicing that I find really helpful is this pencil exercise. And so if you've got this, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a pencil, but something small and clean enough that you're willing to stick in your mouth for a second here. So I've got mine here. Using the eraser end, you're going to try and find the point in your oral cavity where it's as high as you can possibly go. So I start right behind the teeth and then kind of trace up and back. And that point where it stops, that's right where the hard palate and the soft palate sort of intersect at the top of the oral cavity. And for me, I like to aim at my air at that spot. Sometimes I think about the air instead of, just blowing air, just kind of out into the open. Instead, aiming it to that spot, almost like it's going to go directly out the top of my head. And what I find this does, it helps raise the soft palate and therefore creates more space in the oral cavity, more resonant space for the sound to sort of resonate and vibrate, and it improves the overall tone quality. And it also helps get the tongue a little higher as well, I think, if we're just aiming up at that point. So again, that's just kind of tracing back until you find the highest point in the oral cavity, and then aiming my air at that spot. Another exercise that I like is playing in the clarion register without the register key. So I start this but with playing a high C at a moderate dynamic, and then I eventually remove the register key and slur down to an F, kind of starting on the 5th note of an F major scale and then going down to scale degree 1. If the notes continue to speak in the higher register, the tongue is in a good position for proper legato. But if the notes drop out, your tongue is either too low or too far back in the oral cavity, or maybe both. So that would sound like this. And that was with tongue high and forward. On this next demonstration, I'm going to drop my tongue considerably lower from the start, and we'll see how we sort of lose the notes. And this is a really good way to check our own voicing. And I find that giving students something to listen to and sort of a attainable goal is more helpful sometimes than just saying tongue higher, tongue higher, tongue higher, or tongue forward, all of that. And to make this even more challenging, you can try having them articulate the notes without the register key. That's a really good way to check their articulation as well. It's sort of an unrelated subject, but tangentially related. And keep going down. Descend chromatically until the first note drops out when the register key is removed. And it becomes much harder the lower you go. If I'm starting on maybe 4th line D, that's a lot harder by the time you get to that point. So this one is just always a good test, and this will help our tone quality, our intonation, and our legato all at once. Another exercise that I find really helpful for voicing is the harmonic drill. And this helps us identify our voicing for our clarion and altissimo registers, what we might call the 3rd and 5th partial of the overtone series. This comes from Bert Hara, who is the associate principal clarinet of the LA Philharmonic. At least this is where I was introduced to the exercise. And to do this, you play a Chalumeau C, and then you alter your voicing, tongue position, and or the shape of your oral cavity. Sometimes it's all three, to produce an out of tune clarion G, and then an altissimo E, without changing your fingerings at all. that. Go and try that right. Go ahead and try that right now. Just see what that feels like. See if you can change the tongue position and the voicing to get that higher note to speak while still fingering that low C. It may help to think about the angle of your air. Sometimes maybe thinking a little higher or a little lower as well. And I like to keep going up until you're starting on an open G. And on some of these lower notes, you can get a fourth harmonic. It's pretty out of tune, but it can be done depending on how low you start. Yeah. And that's helping you explore sort of the different harmonics and how do we actually produce those in terms of voicing, tongue position, oral cavity, all of that. I always like to tell the story how I was doing these as an undergrad in the practice room. And the practice room I was in happened to be right next to a classroom where they were doing an ear training exam. And the instructor actually came out of the exam, found my practice room, and told me I either had to stop doing those or leave because they couldn't do the exam. So make sure you're not going to disturb anyone while you do these. But I do always think about that when I'm working on these exercises. Another helpful exercise comes from Fred Orman, who is the retired professor of clarinet at the University of Michigan. And this helps going back and forth between the clarion and the altissimo registers. Using the high clarion C as a bass, we alternate between a fake fingering and a traditional fingering going into the altissimo. And we're trying to match the quality of the legato in the traditional fingering to the fake one. And what it means is we're essentially starting on a C. I'll go to a D flat. We'll use you might be a trill fingering, for instance. Back to C. And now to the regular fingering. And we want that to try and feel as easy and as free-blowing and as relaxed as we had the fake fingering. And I've got these sort of shown here, just the fingerings that I use. So here's this first one we did, just C, D flat with the side keys, C, regular D flat, and then back to C. So if you've got your instrument, go ahead and give that a shot. And we want to match the legato quality across the registers. And this keeps going. We can do this with D, and for me, I just use an open fingering for the D. The fingerings get a little more complex the higher we go. E flat, it's like then you're just adding the A key for the fake fingering. And we should feel the same way as when we're playing the fake as when we're playing the regular. E natural is like an overblown or a squeaked throat tone B flat. Then the last one I usually do is going up to an F. And that's like this, and the fake fingering is just like that E, but you're going to add the third side key. These are a great practice tool. And sometimes you can use these, incorporate these fingerings into the repertoire, which makes that either for practice or for actual use, depending on your personal preference. Moving on to some finger technique, I wanted to look a little bit at the first Rose study out of the 40 studies and talk about how Daniel Bernard used this to teach the legato technique. Some of this may already be familiar with this study, some this may be the first time, so we'll kind of look at it together. When it comes to legato, Bernard talked about lifting the finger slightly, and then, especially as you're coming down, then gently squeezing the air. And it's a sort of a gooey quality as the finger squeezes the instrument, without slapping. And the finger motions should never be so forceful as to disrupt the airstream. So if you were playing that's, you know, sort of bumping the sound. And we want to avoid that if at all possible, just as light as possible. I had a teacher who talked about, it's like you had one of those really long balloons that you get from like that clowns use to make balloon animals. And you want to be holding that and you don't want to pop the balloon with your finger motion, just kind of gently pressing into it or squeezing it. So Bernard used 3 different portions from this etude to teach this finger motion. And he would start actually with measures 8 and 9 because they were stepwise motion for the most part. Then thirds and fourths in measures 3 and 4. And finally, at the very beginning of the etude, you had these much larger intervals. So as you're coming down this scale in measure 8, lifting motion before you do the drop, that ends up being so important for this. And then you can expand that to start using 2 fingers at a time in the 3rd and 4th measures. Before finally moving to your big intervals in measures 1 and 2. And of course, whenever we're practicing it with this way, we're doing it much slower than the etude is generally performed. You know, really using just the music as a way to practice that finger motion in isolation. So that's a really great way to kind of drill that in. A couple other things with finger technique, and this pertains especially to keeping our hands in a certain position, so we don't deviate from our bass position when we go to activate different keys. A couple exercises that I like to use for this involve, again, the G sharp A key and then that bottom side key. This first one, we end up playing a Shalyumo C, and then while fingering that C, use the left hand first finger to open up the G sharp key, then the A key. And this guarantees that the left hand first finger can access those keys without disrupting the hand position. You start out slowly and then get a little faster, you know, and I do it in terms of rhythm, maybe half notes first, then quarters, then eighths. And you can repeat this until it feels comfortable. whole time, this first finger should still be covering that tone hole. What this exercise also demonstrates is how this first finger only needed to be touching the very bottom of the A key. Sometimes when we go to play this A, it can be tempting to lift the hand or go higher up on the key, especially for students. And this exercise sort of works to break that habit. And you'll also discover that at least for me, it's that bottom sort of corner of the A key and the G sharp key in contact with the middle of the side of the finger right here. And I always like to use that as a checkpoint when I'm playing. Make sure I'm staying in touch with the instrument physically. The other way to use a similar approach is on that bottom side key, where we play a shallow B flat and find the hand position where you can touch, or you can feel that side key 1 while playing this B flat. So your first finger is on the tone hole, but we should be able to still be in pretty close contact, if not already feeling that bottom side key. And then while you're fingering that low B flat, open up that bottom side key, and it'll sound like a D roughly. This is another instance where having the wrist in a little further and the thumb, like what I was talking about earlier, a little more over, can really facilitate a great hand position on the instrument. So I find these finger exercises all very helpful in coordinating a good legato. Now a couple embouchure exercises, and this one we don't even need the instrument for, which is great. And this is to help feel the top lips roll in the embouchure. So just form a relatively loose embouchure around your thumb. And then press the top lip down into the thumb until your top teeth aren't in contact anymore. We look a little ridiculous doing this, but that motion of the top lip coming down, we want to feel that same thing on the mouthpiece, where the top lip is almost a fulcrum or gripping the mouthpiece a little more. You can do the same thing on the mouthpiece itself. I tell my students all the time, top lip down, and that reduces the upward motion of the jaw and sort of equalizes the pressure around the mouthpiece, so it's more equal from all directions. Couple exercises now about airflow. The first one is 12th slurs, which we've all probably done at many points in our long tones in our training. And I like this pattern especially. It comes from William H. Stubbins' The Essentials of Technical Dexterity for the Clarinet. Flexibility and the embouchure development pattern. Stubbins was another former professor of clarinet at the University of Michigan. If the air is continuous and the proper voicing is established, our slur from the chalumeau to the clarion will be absolutely pristine. And then as we keep going up to the same pitch we started on, but 2 octaves higher, we want to keep that slur going. Now, if our airflow is not consistent across registers, we'll hear a break when we go from the low E up to the B. We want to avoid that. We need to disconnect the air from the fingers. And what I mean by that is if the fingers have to do something challenging, the air cannot be interrupted by that. It must keep flowing. And then you can keep going higher and higher. Actually, Stubbins takes this up to an open G. And another really nice thing that I like that he says about this is an effort should be made to hear the third partial as an overtone while the fundamental is being sounded. So while you're sitting on this low note, try and hear the overtone E that is your next note, at least if we're starting on A. Try and hear the second note in the quality of the first note. And that's going to help bring out more upper overtones in the sound and give us more resonance and ring. So when we're playing that low E, we want to try and listen for, when we're playing the low A, we want to listen for the E. While we're playing, it's much harder with headphones on, so make sure you don't have headphones when you're listening for that. But that also gets us listening to the sound as we sit on this low note and feel the shape moving through it. One other thing in this is the clarion altissimo slurs. And these are just slurs of a sixth going up. And if the air is continuous and proper voicing is established, the slur from the clarion to the altissimo register will be pristine. And I find it really helpful to half-hole the ascending slur, where you're, instead of lifting the finger straight up and down like this, you slide this left-hand finger down off the chimney, and it creates a smaller vent point initially, which makes our response a little quicker and smoother. And that, again, that sort of downward motion. I always describe it as if you're like flicking something or like brushing a piece of dust off the instrument. Coming down this way gives us a slightly smaller vent point, and then those notes will speak faster. The descending slur, on the other hand, you have to be very precise and fast to close that hole back up. And it's a quick squeeze in this case, not a slow motion. And more pressure from that top lip will facilitate a smoother interval. After having gone through a lot of these exercises, I wanted to take some time to look at how we can apply some of these concepts and others in actual music. You know, how does this make sense in outside of just the confines of the exercise, you know, repertoire, making music, how does it all apply? And talking about different issues with this. So, in this passage from Brahms' Third Symphony, the second movement, our challenge is to go from our throat tone A to our clarion B very smoothly and almost not hearing that gap in the registers. Sometimes this can, when we play this, we get instead of a smooth interval as we're moving from resistant or free blowing resistant. And what I find really helpful for this is, one way to practice this is isolate our airstream by just forming the embouchure off the instrument and blowing through that aperture as you finger along. You can't go as long to do a full phrase with that. But just isolating the air and making sure it's consistent will then make it much easier to play. And right there, that A to the E, another problematic interval. So I might take the air and practice it that way. Another possible solo where we can really examine our legato is Shostakovich's 10th Symphony, the first movement. And I find this one especially daunting because for anyone who's played this symphony in this part, you'll remember this. You sit there for, I don't remember how many measures. It's a solid 2 minutes of nothing. Then you have to come in and play the solo on this fourth line D piano and get the immediate response. And our challenge is to go from our clarion D to B flat and back to C. And for me, I always like to, while I'm playing the D, I like to make sure my finger's in contact with the A key. That's going to improve my connection going to the throat B flat. So again, that sort of tactile response to the instrument. A couple other things that are very helpful for this, and just sustaining our air, is articulating an eighth note subdivision in the long notes to ensure motion in each sustained pitch. What that does is it ensures that we're still spinning our air as the pitch sustains. You know, we talk about between the notes as it pertains to legato. I always like to add the inside caveat, because if we don't shape through a note, we're never going to be able to make a smooth connection to the next note. So playing inside the notes, inside the long notes, is just as important as playing between them. Another thing that's really helpful for this is, and you can do this almost out of time. It almost doesn't work in this solo if you're in time, but play with a really exaggerated swell and then a forte piano. It's going to really ensure each note's moving to the next one, even though we wouldn't play it like this in the orchestra. That really exaggerated swell and phrasing each note into the next one helps make sure each note has a bridge to the following pitch. And all of that's going to make playing that much easier. Now, another passage for legato, and I alluded to this one earlier, crossing registers, and this is from Schubert's Shepherd on the Rock, the part of that beautiful opening clarinet melody, is going from the C to the D flat cleanly. And one thing that works out really well is to try practicing this with a fake fingering, that third partial fingering. So you can feel that, what it feels like to play that D flat without the biting. And I know some people actually, and yeah, you've brought up the point I was just about to get to. A lot of people actually just use the fake fingering for this passage. I don't, and that's entirely your choice. I know a lot of people who do this. Some of my former instructors will actually do this. I have never really cared for it, honestly. I find the tonal quality of that side fingering a little thin, and the intonation isn't quite as nice. So for me, I've always tried to use the regular fingering, but that's and I know a lot of people who make the side key work really well. So that's again sort of your artistic prerogative as the player. For me, I've just always preferred to for me, the tonal quality just works a little better, but that's entirely your choice, and that's a great point you brought up. Thanks for sharing that. Going now to everyone's, well, maybe not everyone's favorite, one of my favorite clarinet concertos, Mozart, the second movement. I find slow music is especially hard for legato at a especially slow tempo because it's harder to feel the shape across the line, you know. Sometimes that C to the F, if we're not feeling a steady pulse, and feeling that note leading. So what I like to do is get away from the instrument sometimes. Take a plain drinking straw in a balloon. Put the straw into the neck of the balloon, sort of just wrap it so it seals, and then try and play through this instead of the instrument. And the balloon should constantly be expanding. That tells us we've got good air velocity if the balloon is actually expanding as we go. And visualizing that expansion ends up helping how we shape our air. You can't do this for super long periods of time, just because you're going to eventually have to breathe, or you're going to end up inhaling your own carbon dioxide like I just did. But this works really well in short bursts. And now, is so much easier as a result. There's two modifications to this that I really like as well. The first one, now that once you try, I like the straw because it gets away from the instrument. We're not even thinking about the clarinet at that point. We're just dealing with air. But one thing you can do carefully, don't drop your mouthpiece doing this, is place the balloon actually on the mouthpiece tenon itself and try and play your phrase shape on the mouthpiece. Sometimes you'll get a little tone out of it. That's okay, although I find that having a sufficiently relaxed embouchure and not biting too much, you generally won't get a sound. Sometimes if there's constant sound, it's maybe a sign we're putting too much pressure on the reed itself from the jaw. Something else you can do, and I just did this one ahead of time, you can tape the balloon around the straw so you can blow through the straw and finger on the clarinet. So that's another great way to practice this. And it actually helps because then you can get the feeling of moving your fingers while still blowing, but not having to deal with the resistance of the instrument itself. There are constantly balloons and straws in my office, in my backpack, just everywhere. So I use this a lot with students. It ends up being really helpful. Although it does kind of look like you just threw a party or something with all the deflated balloons out there. This passage from the Poulenc Sonata for Clarinet, I find that actually challenging to execute. Even though there's not anything intrinsically technical, it's maintaining the connection and the fluidity through the dotted rhythm and all of these sort of changes. So one of the things I like to do with this is I'll actually stand up to play this, sort of angle my torso to one side, and then as I'm playing, sort of rotate around. This helps me visualize linear playing instead of just being very beat oriented and feeling a longer shape. And sometimes you either have to come back around or spin slower, but that really is a great way to practice. And it also just kind of helps you stay loose while you're playing. And then if I were to go back and play this, it's much easier to feel a sense of line through all of this, despite Poulenc's indication of monotone. The beginning of Copland's Clarinet Concerto, another huge legato challenge for us. And for me, the biggest challenge in this, besides the tempo, is the fingers and making sure they're legato at all times, especially this interval from the D to the C sharp. And what I like to do is, and that's because you've got fingers moving in contrary motion. You've got the middle finger of the right hand moving down while the pinky comes up. And what I like to do is I'll actually practice this with a glissando between those two notes. And if you get a smooth glissando, it means your air is consecutive between those notes. And I think it helps ensure a relaxed finger motion. And just doing that in isolation, because you have to have a certain delicateness of the fingers to do the glissando. And the air's got to stay moving between the notes. So then after doing that, it's so much easier to go. Etc. It's a wonderful piece. I wanted to spend a good amount of time talking about wide intervals in the repertoire because we get them a lot. And phrasing through these. And this example from Robert Schumann's Fantasiestück, the second movement, is a great example. So you have this huge interval going from the clarion low or the clarion long B up to the high C. And it's really easy, especially on an A clarinet, to get a sort of grunt as you go up to the C, or where you're not tonguing, but there's not a connection between the notes. And what I'll do with things like this is adjust the octave of certain pitches to make the musical line more linear and conjunct. And it also reduces the likelihood of the embouchure contorting to make that big interval happen. So when we originally had this, I'll change that to make it in that sort of linearized version helps me feel my air moving through the big interval. And you can do this with a lot of examples. The Schumann fantasy pieces are just one example where it's pretty prominent. Brahms, another example. Big intervals, huge intervals in these opening four measures of the first movement from the F minor. It's very common to hear. Where we don't get that smooth connection, that vocal quality. So what I'll do sometimes is add a scalar run. This is kind of like adding the glissando, but adding a scale run to that interval to ensure the airstream is connecting the two notes. And maybe out of time, but just playing, filling in that space with the stepwise motion is so much makes the air so much easier. And that ensures that the air is connecting through those, and then it makes it so much more free. A good half-hole technique is also essential for this C, E flat, I find. And the first time I played it, or most recent time, when it didn't quite speak, I realized just playing it now, I was like, the air wasn't connecting. I was stopping, and that's why we got the break. So blowing through that long note. And again, practicing with to get makes a huge difference. Another classic huge interval. Very wide in this case. Weber's Second Concerto, first movement, going from this D all the way to the high F. And in addition to everything we've already talked about, pressing and leaning on that lower note, then floating up to the high one, almost like you were pushing into a trampoline and then coming up, helps make it feel more connected. Because sometimes that top note will pop, and we want to balance that interval by making the louder note play the note that will project more easily a little softer, so it feels even as a result. This not opening, but the pickup to 50 in Kodai's Dances of Galanta. Our challenge, I think, is making the legato from the C to the D happen, especially as we're getting softer and maybe a little slower and going higher up. Trying not to pinch with the embouchure, because sometimes we play this and you've just done your whole big cadenza, and then we have to be very delicate and go. And we get that break sometimes. If the air is not moving, if the embouchure is too tight. And what I like to do with this is press up with the right thumb and out with the left thumb a little bit as you cross the registers. And that helps reduce the biting tendency. And just keeping the embouchure as relaxed as it can be while still producing the characteristic sound and having the control we want. I saved this one for last in this sort of quick deep dive into repertoire with legato, because I think this brings up a really good point. I think this 4 measures from the Premier Rhapsody is so challenging because there's a multitude of register crosses, resistance changes, and all of that can kind of distract from our musical intent, especially in sort of this amorphous melody. So I find singing the line instead, and it doesn't have to be like super well pitched or great, but just singing with intention can help us free ourselves from the confines of the instrument, and it releases our sense of phrasing. So my practice. And that really forced me, just doing it now, forces me to think about how I'm using my air and how I'm shaping my phrase. Because it's much easier to just sit on a note on the clarinet, I think, than when you're singing. We feel the momentum or lack thereof more when we're producing the tone with our vocal cords. And that makes then going. Much more convincing. So to wrap everything up today, and thank you for those of you who have been here for the whole time. Thank you for sticking with me. I appreciate that. There are four main elements to our legato production: our voicing, our embouchure, our finger technique, and our airflow. And all four of those work together to produce this idea of legato, playing inside and between each note. And all these suggestions that we made, both in terms of exercises and repertoire and concepts, you can combine those to produce the sound that you want to make musically and produce the shapes that you want. The clarinet is kind of a goofy instrument in a lot of ways. It's not perfectly designed, no matter who you get it from. There are just some acoustical things that we just have, some idiosyncrasies due to its design that makes certain things playing this instrument challenging. But make sure you're playing the clarinet and don't let the instrument play you. And a clear musical idea is often going to guide us to a technical solution. If we know the shape and the line we want, we'll find a way. You'll all find a way to make that shape happen, just with enough experimentation and practice and being open to trying new things. And I hope you found today's presentation really helpful. If anyone has any questions, I think we have some time now. And anyone has any questions or wants to connect, you can check in with me on social media, my website. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all pretty much the same username on all of those. And before I forget, I really wanted to say thank you to Silverstein Works for organizing the Silverstein Clarinet Contest and the Masterclass series. All of the judges who will be partaking in this great event, all of the sponsors who were so kind to serve as sponsors with donations and supporting the contest. And thank you especially to everyone today for attending this class. This was wonderful, wonderful to kind of try and share these ideas, and I was glad we were able to have some questions and discussion. And right now, I'd be happy to talk about anything else that people might want to ask questions about as it relates to anything I talked about today, or on other topics, if we're okay and we have the time for that. It's just like college classes sometimes.
A lot of things good.
Yeah, what's up?
Good, thanks. Good. Thank you so much for this information. It's been really, really great to hear about this wonderful clarinet, technique, and to assist us to play better. Thank you so much. I wanted to play for you a little bit. I don't know if I'm allowed to or not in the masterclass. Just the opening of this Stravinsky third movement of the three pieces for clarinet.
I don't see why we couldn't do that. Is there? I don't see why not. If you want to play a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Need to move my phone this way.
Oh, it's okay. That's okay.
Yep. I'll start from bar 37.
All right.
I try to play it as accurate as I can, but I always find I struggle with modern music, like with counting and playing accurately and dynamics. You have to always exaggerate things, and I find like, how do you make it stand out all the time and make it because you're on your own. Usually when you play with piano, you can rely with someone you're playing with. But playing solo music is so different because you've got to be on your own and like fill up the whole room and still make it impressive to your audience.
Yeah, you know, well, first of all, congratulations on that performance. That was a wonderful rendition you just gave us, and I really impressive. And you brought up a good point as it pertains to energy in all of this. And
Thank you.
I find with this movement in particular, it's not about giving more accent. It's about giving less accent where it's not printed. So I can hear you giving a lot of fire in this, and it's a great spirited performance. I apologize. I was trying to find my own copy of this. At least PDF form. Here we go. So for me, oh boy, I'm just gonna. I don't have measure numbers, but I'm hoping. I'm gonna start.
I can see.
You can see it. Cool. I'm gonna start. Maybe right there. Oops, that was drawing in white. But this 3/8 bar right here. I'll admit I have not looked at this piece in quite a while, but I would go slower. And I think Stravinsky marks. Sometimes he gives that very vertical like martelé stroke, and other times it's more of the accent. I would put a little more lightness on the martelé personally, and then give more punch on the accent. So if we went under tempo. And it gives it a bit of more of like a dance or jazz feel, without getting too much into the historical nature of this piece. The sort of common belief is that Stravinsky was influenced by jazz and jazz clarinet playing when he wrote this, especially this movement. So with jazz, it's all about the style, all about the sort of inflection. And I think we could use more inflection in this. Could you try maybe from that 3/8 bar? Yeah, that's fantastic. So that, to me, I'm hearing more shape now as a result of that. And I think that I would apply that to this entire movement. You're doing a great job with all the technical components of this, the finger motion and everything. This 2/8 at the end. That 2/8 bar, your tongue sounds like it's a little too low when you do the triplet. So make sure, I almost feel like I'm just playing F the whole time there. So if you can voice higher there, and another spot I noticed it was this for the 5/16 right here. Just a slightly higher voicing. And it sounds like, were you using a regular C sharp fingering in that triplet?
Yes, I was, yes.
I might consider a side key. So for me, it's B, and then I use the third side key.
Okay.
Yeah, you might find that helpful.
That's very nice. That's a good one. That's a good.
I'm happy to help. You're doing a really nice job with this. Does anyone else have any questions?
Okay.
congratulations to the lady for sharing that with us.
Thank you so much for helping me out, Dr. Cook.
Oh, of course. It's a pleasure to hear you play. Is anyone any other questions out there that people might have? I know we've been staring at a screen for a while today, and thank you for being here today. All right. Well, if anyone again has anything they'd like to ask, or at a later point, you can connect with me here. Again, this is sort of my social media and internet presence here, my website, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of that stuff. And I'm happy to discuss anything that people might want to know. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us today as a part of the Silverstein Clarinet Contest Masterclass series. And I hope everyone will, check out the remainder of the Masterclass series. It's a great lineup, and I'm really honored to be included in part of this with fantastic teachers and players from all around. And consider entering the contest if you haven't already done so. And thank you again for all of your time today and your questions, and best of luck with everything else that lies ahead. Thanks, everyone.